Good afternoon, and welcome to our New York Archives Magazine online speaker series. I'm Josie Madison, editor of New York Archives. Today, we're joined by Jennifer Burns, Amy Murrell Taylor, and Jasmine Bumpers for our program, Hidden in the Archives, Stories of New York's Forgotten Female Figures. Jennifer Burns is a lecturer in the Department of Africana Studies at the University at Albany. She earned her master's and doctoral degrees in American history from the History Department at UAlbany, and her doctoral dissertation, Black Trojans, the Grassroots Abolition Campaign of the Free Black Community in Troy, New York, before 1861, was awarded the 2019 Distinguished Dissertation Award. She has presented at numerous community events and conferences and is a frequent panelist on WAMC's The Roundtable program. Dr. Burns also serves on the executive board of the Underground Railroad Education Center in Albany and the Hart Cluett Museum in Troy. Amy Murrell Taylor is the T. Marshall Hahn Jr. Professor of History at the University of Kentucky. She is an historian of the 19th century US with a focus on the era of the Civil War, Emancipation, and Reconstruction. And her books include Embattled Freedom, Journeys Through the Civil War's Slave Refugee Camps. She previously taught in the history department at the University at Albany. Jasmine Bumpers is an archivist at the New York State Archives. She also serves as an editorial consultant for New York Archives Magazine. And just a bit of housekeeping, we will be having a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So for those of you who have joined us today, please feel free to submit questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And we will try to get to as many of those as we can at the end of the presentation. And now I am happy to turn it over to Jasmine Bumpers.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'll just share my screen. Okay. So the first woman I wanted to talk about is someone named Sarah Rosetta Lakeman. And she was a Civil War soldier. At least 400, though possibly up to 1,000 women fought in the Civil War, disguised as men for both the Union and Confederate armies. And this is one of those stories of such a soldier. So let's get into this a little bit here. So Sarah Rosetta Wakeman was born on January 16, 1843, and raised in Afton, New York, which is a town about 30 miles from Binghamton. She grew up in a farming family, very poor family, the oldest of 9 children. As a teenager, she worked as a domestic briefly, didn't make a lot of money there. So she actually disguised herself as a man to get a job as a boatman for the Shenango Canal, which is a canal that ran from Binghamton to Utica, ran along the Shenango River. And it was during that time, Army recruiters came around and were seeking people to enlist for the Union Army. And she was enticed to do it by the bounty that was being offered at the time. So she did, she enlisted as a man and enlisted on August 30th, 1862 in Root, New York, in Montgomery County, and was mustered into service on October 17th, 1862 in Company H of the 153rd New York Volunteer Infantry under the pseudonym Lyons Wakeman. Which is actually a different pseudonym than the one she used when she was working as a boatman. And this is a record here at the New York State Archives. It's Sarah's muster roll abstract. It provides a lot of the information I just shared with you all, the date that she mustered in, the location, which is Root, her age, which she actually lied about her age. She said she was 2 years older than she really was. Not uncommon. So she mainly worked as a not a prison, but just a guard during her service. But she did see active battle at the Battle of Pleasant Hill, which was part of the Red River Campaign in April 1864. She survived, but she ended up contracting chronic diarrhea, likely from drinking contaminated water. She was hospitalized, but succumbed to the chronic diarrhea in June of 1864. And despite being hospitalized, she was still buried as Lyons Wakeman in Chalmette National Cemetery in Louisiana. So supposedly her identity didn't come out at that time. However, in this deaths of officers and enlisted men, which is also at the New York State Archives. This is data that was collected by through questionnaires, usually submitted by family, friends, relatives, military, hospital personnel. Might not be able to see it, it's kind of small, but the second to last name on the register is Lyons Wakeman. It's Sarah's information. And under remarks, it has right name, Sarah R. Wakeman. Which is kind of cool because it's actually a legitimate connection that proves that this was Sarah. During her days as a soldier, she was writing to her family under her given name. So they knew she was fighting. So they likely, when they were requesting information about Lyons' service, told them that, this was in fact our, our daughter, sister, Sarah. So it was a really interesting find when I found that. All right, so I'm talking about my next person here, and this is Sojourner Truth, who's actually a very well-known Black abolitionist and women's rights activist. She's definitely not a forgotten or lesser known female figure from New York State history. But I want to talk about her because maybe outside of academia, many people might not know that she was the first Black woman to win a case against white men in court. And it was this suit where she obtained custody of her 9-year-old son, Peter, who had been sold into slavery in the Deep South, that I wanted to talk about with you all today. So these documents are actually very, very recently discovered in the New York State Archives. We're in the middle of updating our court records guide, and a re-examination of court records series needs to be done. And that's when some of our staff stumbled upon these records. The proceedings were filed under the name Isabella Van Wagner. Sojourner Truth's original name or given name was Isabella, and Van Wagner was a surname of the family that assisted her. During this court case, she was represented by 2 attorneys from Kingston. It was argued in March of 1828 in the Supreme Court of Judicature, which was the predecessor of the Supreme Court. So a little background information. In 1799, an act for the gradual abolition of slavery was passed, and basically stipulated that any children born to enslaved mother after July 4th of that year was technically considered free, but they still had to provide services for their enslaved mother's owner until the age of 28 for men, or for male children, and 25 for female. So though Truth was freed in 1826, her son Peter, who was born in 1818, she was still enslaved at that time. So he was an indentured servant for her former master, John Dumont. When he was 5, he was sold into slavery to Eliezer Gedney, who later sold Peter to his brother Solomon. And then Solomon later sold Peter to a relative in Alabama. When Truth found out about this, she tried to get him back. And with the help of her lawyers and the Van Wagners, she sued Peter's owner and the courts as well for allowing the illegal sale to take place. Peter was eventually ordered by the courts to be returned to Truth, and his owner in Alabama was charged with kidnapping, but he avoided prosecution by returning Peter, although he was returned in really bad shape, unfortunately. So these next couple of slides are the actual documents that we discovered in the New York State Archives for the People versus Solomon Gedney. And Solomon Gedney was the one who sold Peter to the relative in Alabama. First, this is the writ of habeas corpus that was issued on March 10th, 1828. Habeas corpus means, trying to get the official Latin translation here, that you have the body, which basically the writ commands the person who has custody of the individual to present them to the court to determine whether that detention is lawful or unlawful. So this right here is the writ. This next document is Isabella's deposition, where she talks about a lot of the information that I already relayed to you about Peter's situation, the sales that took place. Next is Gedney's response, where he outright claimed he had never owned Peter, didn't sell him, didn't export him, just tried to wash his hands of it all. And this last document is actual order from the court, which required that Peter be returned to Truth. And that was issued on March 15th, 1828. And then I am all set here. I'm going to pass this off now to Jennifer.
What I chose to focus on is how African Americans were pursuing high school education for Black girls in Troy, New York, really starting right after the American Revolution and runs into 1873, when the state itself finally passes legislation to desegregate schools, which made it possible then to open up the high school in Troy, New York to Black girls. Next slide, please. There we go. So the quest for high school education for African-American girls in Troy, New York really began about 60 years before a man named Alfred B. Williams filed a lawsuit on behalf of his daughter, Janie Williams, against the Troy School Board in the middle of the Civil War in 1863. Before he filed this suit, African Americans in Troy had been pursuing education for adults, but also for children. The initial steps were taken in the 1810s, and it was through cooperation with the Sabbath School Association of Troy. And in 1816, they formalized that into what was called School 4 for colored children. This was education of all level, but largely religious instruction. But due to the demand of African Americans to have a public school, this ends up transitioning as emancipation comes into play in 1827. Right after that, the African American leaders in the city, led by William Rich and Harry Martin, pursue a building to establish a Negro schoolhouse. And that takes place in 1833. And it's this building here that you see that 7 years later becomes the Liberty Street Presbyterian Church. This schoolhouse and the education was focused for African American girls to pursue domesticity, but also for them to be instructed in Latin and other sort of arithmetic and grammar and things like that. But the school was also capped as just a grammar school, which meant that after they got through to almost middle school age, about 11 years old, they would have to apply and take an exam to go to the Troy High School. That process became more challenging, although initially the African American leaders believed that it would be a possibility. Next slide, please. Now, what happens really between the 1840s and the 1860s is that Troy experiences a large in-migration of African Americans from the New England area, but also from places down in the South. And they're mostly free African Americans. One of those families was Alfred Williams and his wife, Mariah, who had a 2-year-old daughter named Jane. Another one of the families was the Bosemans. And Benjamin Boseman Sr. Ended up owning a fleet of ships. He had several children. One of his children was a young lady named Mary C. Boseman, and his second daughter was Ada Boseman. Those children will attend the color school together until 1861. Now, leading up to that, many changes were taking place on the home front, right? The nation's embroiled in the debate over the extension of slavery. Black abolitionists in Troy, New York had created or made the city a hub of abolitionism, but also political convention movements to get suffrage rights for the Black men, and also continue pursuing this demand for higher education for Black girls. By 1861, what has taken place is through that migration into the city, a man named Charles Nally has come to town. Just before the Civil War breaks out, Charles now is discovered and that he's a runaway. And in that discovery, a man is pursuing him to return him to slavery. The African American community will then lead a Jerry rescue to rescue him or save him, prevent him from being sent back into slavery. And within a couple of years during the Civil War, Charles Nally's family, who were free already, will then join him in Troy, New York. His youngest daughter, Lucy, will start to attend the colored school alongside Jane Williams and other children of the prominent African American families like Mary Boseman and her sister Ada Boseman. Then in the summer of 1863, after Abraham Lincoln has issued the Emancipation Proclamation and the Conscription Act, in Troy, there will be a serious draft riot, right? And at that point, there had been already some changes that the community itself was resisting, like allowing African-American girls in particular to enter the high school. 1 year before, in 1862, Ada Boseman had applied to take the examination. If she passed the exam, she was allowed into the high school. Her father, Benjamin Boseman, pushed for this. She took the exam and she passed. So she then entered the school. And African Americans in the community who had been pushing for education thought this was leading toward a more integrated high school, because prior to that, as you can see on these slides, newspaper clippings from the time, the school actually had admitted 1 or 2 other African American children. However, after the draft riot, when Alfred Williams goes to sign his daughter Jane up for the admissions test, the school board refuses to allow her to take the exam. And at the same time, the school board is looking to rewrite many of its policies. One of the things that it does is take out the specific language that was targeted at the African American community and use more racial neutral language, such as students just need to pass an exam. However, the Troy School Board's commissioners also were the ones who got to decide who could take the exam. So this gave them the wiggle room to continue to maintain the racial segregation in the high school, but also to appease many of the white men and women in the community who did not want the school to become integrated. Next slide, please. Alfred Williams will file his lawsuit against the Troy School Board in 1862. It will continue to work through the courts for the remainder of the American Civil War. By the end in 1866, Jane will be about 16 years old. And at that point, the school board doesn't need to allow her to take the exam because they had coined or kind of created this barrier that they could use to their advantage as well, that said that students had to be really between the ages of 12 and 15. So she kind of phased out of being an option. But at the same time, the board does something else. And so they decide to establish a Black high school. They will put that Black high school in the colored school. This became sort of an appeasement to the entire community. And initially, Black leaders were supportive of it because they also believed that it would then increase the funding, create a better facility, and that would help ensure that for young Black girls, they still were able to receive a high school education that would allow them to become teachers. And they had started to see that a little bit because the first African-American woman to become a teacher in this covered school for the high school level was Mary C. Boseman, Ada's older sister. She will subsequently resign her post, and then Ada, after graduating high school, will take her position. So it appeared like there may be some growth there. However, very soon that doesn't take place. Ada Boseman will retain her position. However, the board does not issue any allowances for other girls or boys to take the high school examination. And so the fight continues, though Alfred Williams will end up withdrawing his lawsuit. He'll drop it. This fight continues until 1873. And you can see here that the leaders in Troy were still pushing to have the language changed by the state so that the school board couldn't use race, but also at the same time, they had to establish either an official high school that was not conjoined with this grammar school, or they had to then allow African-American boys and girls into the high school. Next slide, please. Sadly, Jane herself does not really get to witness this. She witnesses most of the fight, but by being over the age to take the exam, right, she was not able to go to the high school. She likely completed her high school studies at the William Rich School. However, by 1870, at 21 years old, she passes away. This is 3 years before the state actually will pass or sign a bill that will require the schools in New York State to desegregate. Next slide, please. Alfred Williams will kind of back away from the school board argument, but it will be taken up and continued by William Rich, who was the main advocate from the beginning for Black education, and other leaders in the school, the William Rich School. And you can see here, poor Alfred lives into the late 1880s. So he gets to witness the desegregation of the school, but he doesn't get to see his daughter go on and perhaps become a teacher, which he might have envisioned, because that push for the high school education would allowed a safeguard so that she may have been able to go on to a profession and not been pigeonholed into domestic service or other things that many African Americans were pushed into during the Civil War and then in the years after, even up in New York State. Next slide, please. Now, Jane does not, sadly, graduate, but there are others who do. This William Rich School will last until 1873. And if anybody here in attendance is familiar with Troy, this building still stands. It is on State Street, and the doors that are sort of over to your left are the firehouse, and the building next to it, more to your left, with a pointed roof, is actually the William Rich School. Today, it is a courthouse in Troy, but the fire station doors and everything are still there. So maybe later, if you're driving through Troy and you head down State Street, you can look over and you'll see this building, which was the colored school up until 1873. The colored school does end in 1873. So they desegregate that high school, and Black girls theoretically could go. I imagine the environment wasn't so welcome. Some of the graduates, however, of the William Rich School go on to do some great things. Mary Boseman and Ada Boseman, along with Charles Nally and his daughter Lucy, will all in 1873 move down to Washington, D.C. And the daughters will continue in Black education in that area. There's another young woman named Nettie Hawkins who will graduate. She will leave the state. She will go to Vermont, and then she will come back to the state later on in the 1880s and the 1890s as an educator in Oswego County. And that is the end of my introduction to Jane Williams and these other young ladies who fought to have the high school education that they rightly deserved in Troy, New York, up until 1873. I'm gonna pass it over to Amy now.
Okay, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for having me here. It's really nice to kind of be back in Albany, even though I'm actually not physically there right now. As Josie mentioned, I used to teach at the University at Albany, and I just have to sort of brag that everybody on this panel was somebody I got to teach when I was at the University at Albany. So you know I was a lucky person. All right, so I'm going to story about a woman too, and let's go to the next slide. The story that I want to tell begins with the New York State Census of 1925, which is at the State Archives. And let's go to the next slide, which is a blow up of what you're seeing there. And the story begins really with one word. It's one highlighted there, financier. Now that's not one that's probably uncommon to see in a census of New Yorkers, but this one appears next to the name of not only a 97-year-old, but also next to the name of a woman. So who is this woman who not only achieved remarkable longevity at 97, but who also at this advanced age was publicly acknowledged to be a manager and investor of money, likely large sums of it, and did so to a degree that even at the age of 97, this is recognized as her occupation. Well, if you keep going kind of to the left there, you can see her name, and it's a name I was familiar with already when I saw this. Her name's Emily Howland. Maybe she's familiar to you too. There's an elementary school in Aurora, New York that's named after her. And next slide. Also, back in 1926, 1 year after the census was taken, she was awarded an honorary degree from the University of the State of New York. She was actually the first woman to receive an honorary degree from the university. So she received these honors, these tributes, for her life's work as an educator. So we're picking up on the education theme that Jennifer just talked about. She was a teacher not only in upstate New York, but also across the South. She was particularly concerned with teaching and setting up schools for newly freed people or formerly enslaved people. She was an abolitionist, she was a suffragist, and she saw in all these causes really the underlying pursuit of social justice and equality. That's really what was driving her here. And this was something that her Quaker family had imparted in her. Now, as you listen to that brief synopsis of her life, maybe it sounds kind of familiar. Here's an elite white Quaker woman in upstate New York who involves herself in abolition and women's rights in the 19th century. I mean, we've heard that story before. Susan B. Anthony, Lucretia Mott, Martha Coffin Wright. In fact, even if you haven't even heard of Emily Howland before, she might already sound like a familiar figure, like her story's already been told, or that we already kind of know her story based on what I've just said. Maybe we don't even need to do much more research. Well, I would never say that. I think it's tempting sometimes as historians to, put our subjects in boxes and assume we know their story. And of course, when that happens, it leads us to overlook certain aspects of their experience that don't necessarily fit the box or fit the story. And that's the kind of inconvenient stuff that remains hidden in the archive. So this is my connection to the theme here. In this case, it's Howland's status as a 97-year-old financier. That's just not something that is well explained by the story of the 19th century reformer. So there is something much more complex that went on in her life, clearly. So how can we understand how she had that designation in 1925? So I'm going to spend the next 5 or 10 minutes revisiting Howland's life with an eye on her money. And yes, she was wealthy. And from that, we can already probably assume or at least understand how this allowed her to wield some cultural power in the United States. She had influence. But what about her financial power? What about her money? How could a woman like her use her financial leverage in the pursuit of social justice? So that's what we'll explore. So let's go to the next image. Howland's story technically begins in 1827, because that's when she's born. But for my purposes today, the story is going to begin in the 1860s, in the midst of the Civil War. The war had unleashed what one historian has called the greatest slave rebellion in American history. And what was happening during the Civil War was that tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of enslaved people began fleeing their plantations and seeking refuge behind the lines of the United States Army, the Union Army. And as they did so, they set up camps for themselves, refugee camps as they were called, and began building new lives. And I was working on a book about this, and that's when I first encountered Emily Howland. Because Howland was one of many Northern people who started leaving the North and going into the South during the war to work in these camps. She went to help set up a school and begin teaching. And she went in 1863 to Arlington, Virginia, so Northern Virginia, the site of the National Cemetery today. But when she got there, it had previously been the land owned by the Confederate General Robert E. Lee. So the Union had seized his land during the war, and it became the site of this camp. So she began teaching, and the people that she met began teaching her a few things as well. She had conversations with a woman, and you can go to the next slide, identified only as Sally, we don't have a last name, who was one of the enslaved people owned by Robert E. Lee. And Sally told her a whole story about Robert E. Lee's brutality towards her daughter and the way he whipped her daughter. It's a really gruesome story, but Howland wrote this up and actually sent it in a letter form to the National Anti-Slavery Standard. As you can see, it was published. This is a little bit of a side note to my story, but This becomes one of the primary pieces of evidence that historians have today to puncture the holes in the Lee myth, that he was some kind of gentleman of honor who stood above slavery. Clearly he was not. So she learns a lot of these stories. From others, she learns about the struggle to reunite families who'd been divided and separated by the slave trade. And then she starts befriending a group of people from Northumberland County, Virginia, which is in the northern neck near the Potomac River. And they start telling her about their desire when this war is over to go back to Northumberland County, but they don't want to work. They don't want to go back to the same plantation. They don't want to go back and work for their owner. They want to set up their own enterprise and become farmers for themselves and work independently. Well, how could they do that? How could they? That's going to require obtaining land that's necessary to live and work independently. Well, one option was in the hands of the federal government. So the Union Army had seized 800,000 acres of Southern land during the war. And so one likely answer to this question, because the people in Northumberland weren't the only people who were expressing a desire for land. One answer was for the federal government to take those 800,000 acres, divide it up, and rent it or sell it to free people. Well, this becomes, some of you may know, a pretty widely debated idea. But by 1866, when the new president, Andrew Johnson, comes in to succeed Abraham Lincoln, he's very Southern sympathetic, white Southern sympathetic. He does not believe in this plan and he kills it. And so any sort of hope of government-led distribution of land dies at that point. The whole promise of 40 acres and a mule dies, or it seemed to. Free people across the South remained determined to find some way of accessing the land on their own, either renting it or buying it. But of course, the barrier lay in the lack of capital that they had. You need money to buy land. And also another barrier was the unwillingness of white landowners to sell them the land, even if they had money. So this brings us back to Emily Howland. This is where Emily Howland comes in. She hears this and recognizes that, well, she has money and she's white and she might be able to do something about this problem. So she's writing letters back home to New York, and her sort of archival footprint is actually quite scattered. I mean, from the New York State Archives down to the Friends Historical Library in Swarthmore College, University of Rochester, she's sort of all around, but a lot of her letters are at Swarthmore. And she writes back to New York and asks her father for assistance. She wants to purchase 400 acres of land in Northumberland County, Virginia, and needs $1,750 to do it. Well, her father, Slocum Howland, was the guardian and the possessor of the family fortune, which had been accumulated because of their ownership of a woolen mill. They were farmers. They also had a general store. And he shared her abolitionist principles and agreed to give her the money. So Emily Howland takes the family money, she purchases the land, and she immediately starts dividing it into 5 to 10 acre allotments. And she institutes a rent to own system where the families could start renting and the rent would go towards paying off the land and eventually they would own it. And so initially families of men named Moses Washington, Lewis Carter, Wesley Green, Benjamin Tolliver, are now in possession of land as a result. Howland called this my Reconstruction policy. Those are the words that she used. So if the government was not going to do this, she was going to do it herself. Next slide. She also paid for a school to be erected for the residents of this area. And you can see that this is a picture from 2012. The school was built in 1867. It was built by some of the people whose names I just read, the residents of this community. And you can see they did a pretty good job with the construction. It's very well built, if it's still standing so well in 2012. Emily Howland would go on to, she would pay for the education of some members of the community to become eventually teachers. Next slide. Including Benjamin Tolliver's daughter, Sidney Tolliver Boyer, in 1883, who would go up to upstate New York to get educated and then come back down to be a teacher. Howland also paid for the teachers' salaries as well as maintenance up until 1921, when it was incorporated into the public school system. So essentially Howland leveraged the power of her family's money to enact the sort of social revolution that freed people and abolitionists like her had hoped would result from the end of slavery. They called the new village Arcadia, that took root there in Northumberland County. And this was where they could work for themselves and become independent and financially stable. But of course, money is rarely provided without strings attached. And in this case, Howland did hold on to some strings. This was not all freely given. She was adamant about the kind of education that would be taught. There was an industrial annex to this school. So students learned shoemaking, basketry, weaving, carpentry, in addition to arithmetic and reading and writing. She wanted them to, really make sure and, seek financial independence. This was all part of sort of her effort to encourage this, and really wanted students in the school to make things that they could go out and sell. Also, in a speech on the 20th anniversary of the school, she wrote about her speech, and she said, "I gave them some counsel upon strong drink and on the noise they made." So she was not, she could be a bit, judgmental, you could say, but also patronizing as well. Maybe, she was preaching the temperance message to them as well, took her position as an opportunity to do so, and also didn't want to hear the noise, as she put it. Well, what Howland did was pretty remarkable. The National Anti-Slavery Standard in April 1869 said she had given us the model, let's enlarge it. So let's get much more private money going to get land in the hands of free people. But this remained more uncommon than common. It didn't take off. But Howland, though, took up other means of directing her family's wealth in the direction of social change. And her parents died by the early 1880s, and it was Emily and a brother who inherited the family fortune. And so Howland starts strategizing about how to use it next. She starts reading John Stuart Mill's Political Economy. She takes 6 months to do it. She has some really great commentary about how hard going it was to read that book. But here's an author, a theorist, who advocated for something closer to socialism, and at the very least for social justice and reform to be a guiding principle of political economy. And it's pretty clear that Howland carries some of those ideas through. She would go on to direct her money in ways to address gender and racial inequalities. She paid for women to go to medical school. She financially supported suffrage organizations. She loaned money to women to open businesses and stores. She loaned money to freed people to establish schools, to establish churches. And it was loans rather than gifts, outright gifts, that became the primary focus of her financial outlays. She lent money to those who could not secure loans from established banks. So those, by virtue of their race or their gender, just could not get a loan, or people who just didn't have the collateral to be able to secure a loan. And so what happens is, and you can kind of see it in some of the account books that she keeps, she becomes basically the director of her own private bank. That's really by the 1780s is really what she's become. And then in 1891, she's appointed the first woman director of a national bank in the United States. And she becomes a director of the Aurora National Bank in Aurora, New York. And just a little context, this is at a time when we're seeing more and more women's public involvement in finance. Just 15 years before, Victoria Woodhull, another women's rights advocate, she and her sister opened a Wall Street brokerage. And in 1919, the first women's bank in the country was established in Tennessee. So Howland's kind of part of a wave here in that respect. She kept detailed accounts of the loans she approved, as I said. And, unlike a gift, the fact that she was giving out loans allowed her to maintain some control over the money and the people involved. So there were some strings attached here. She wanted to see and make sure people were working hard for their money and would, sort of exercise the qualities of thrift and savings that she wanted to see in them. And she charged interest on these loans. So she made sure to protect her own investment in this process, which probably helps to explain why she maintained this financial position and maintained her longevity as a financier, so much so that she is listed in the 1925 census with that occupation. And I'll just conclude by noting that was 4 years before she died. She died at the age of 101. So very, very long life. But I will leave it there because I know we want to have time for questions.
Thank you so much. These have been some great stories. And I do want to take a few minutes here to just ask some questions. The first question is actually about Jennifer's presentation. And the question is, which political party was in power when Troy was deciding against allowing Black children in high school?
In Troy, the Democrats, who were Southern sympathizers, were in power. However, the state legislature was Republican. The school board itself was bipartisan. And interestingly enough, the school board's members, there were 22 of them, they were more divisive by their church affiliations. So the Presbyterians and the Universalists were more pro, we'll integrate the schools and we'll find ways to do it. But the Catholics were adamantly opposed. So the leadership was divided between, right, there was this kind of contest between the Democrats who were in control politically, but then in the school board itself, it was bipartisan. And then all of it was under the umbrella of the Republican state legislature.
So that's interesting. There are other things at play that are not just politics, that are sort of deciding how people align on these issues. So we do have a question about Emily Howland and whether she is able to recover all the funds that she lent. And I'm not sure, Amy, if you can answer that, but.
Yeah, that's a really hard one. I'm pretty sure the answer is no. But her, and I didn't bring a picture of some of her account books, which is really the only way to kind of do some sort of analysis of this. She used her own little codes and it was kind of a little bit messy in keeping track of things. She did have, a lot of people were paying her back. She has that recorded in her books, but I just can't believe that she recouped everything. That's, interesting question. She tried. I wouldn't say she was particularly tough in going after people who maybe were, hadn't paid up. There's no evidence that she was really hounding people. But she certainly expected it and people did. So.
We have another question about Emily. The census that we saw briefly on the screen, the guest thought that she saw a C for colored and was surprised when you said she was white. What did the C indicate on the census?
Oh gosh, I have to go back and look at it. It wasn't race. I can take a look really quick. I'm trying to remember that. Go to another question. I'll report back to you.
Okay, that sounds
There's
good.
A lot of codes in that.
Yeah. Well, I actually have a question that's kind of for everyone. My interest obviously is always in the archives and the archival sources for these things. And the title of our presentation today is Hidden in the Archives. And, why are the stories of women hidden in the archives, and how can we go about finding those stories just as a matter of practical research? So that's for anybody who wants to jump in. Jasmine, as an archivist, can you give us some advice?
I think it's really hard to do. A lot of the times, a lot of the interesting stories I come across are things that I just stumble upon and helping other researchers with their genealogy or dissertations, whatever they're working on. It's kind of how I found the story about Sarah Wakeman. I'm pretty sure I was probably doing a genealogy request, and you kind of sometimes get down a rabbit hole. You start looking for things and you start looking at the details, and most of the stuff I tend to come across or I've presented about or written about before, all just things I found randomly. And I think just that's just what we got to keep doing, just keep looking and digging and whatever we're interested in, and just keep looking into stuff. And that's how we find things. I think it's really hard to try. I feel like whenever I'm trying to find something I expect, it doesn't turn out the way I hope. And it's really those hidden gems, just by looking for other things when you come across some of those interesting stories.
I would say for me, part of it is that when things were recorded, especially 19th century, everything was male dominated and male focused. And so I keep that in mind whenever I'm reading things that talk about the preeminent men. The next question always is, who is their wife? Who are their daughters? Where did they live? Right? Did they have any siblings? And so I tend to get at the other stories by pulling from the lives of those men. The other way that I do it is often through newspapers. I love old newspapers. They have little scraps everywhere about women that you often skip right over because, the headline and everything is focused on men. And the other place that I often find the stories of Black women come from, especially in New York State and local areas, they come from school minutes. They come from account books like Amy was using for people in New York State who were paying their domestics or who owned slaves, because they often have the names of women who they paid in them, as they're keeping their own records. And so that cross-referenced with the census is how I get more, into their stories more.
Well, first I'll just say the C is for citizen.
Thank you.
Clarify that. And as I was looking that up, I might have missed the question, but I think you're asking, how do we find women? How do we pull them out of the archives? Yeah. I think, you've heard two great answers already. And I would just say that you have to just let go of assumptions. Oh, women wouldn't be there. Women weren't there. As Jennifer's saying, they're kind of always there in some way. And so I think that's really important. And also in my research, especially not Emily Howland so much, but when I was looking at some of the women in these refugee camps, you have to not get hung up on looking for women's words and assuming you're always going to find their voice somewhere. You might not, but you're going to see where they are and maybe what they're doing, evidence of actions, and you can interpret a lot accordingly from that. So I think that's true for all women, but especially women of color in the 19th century. You can't be deterred by the archival imbalance when it comes to women.
Yeah, so it's just a matter of being alert to the fact that they were there and being open to different ways of pulling those stories out of the records that we do have. We have a question about all of the people we've heard about today. What were the education levels of each of the women presented here, if we know that information?
Mm-hmm. I can start. Well, Truth was illiterate. The way she was able to give her deposition and file the suit was with the help of the Van Wagner family, as well as those two sympathetic Kingston lawyers. Despite being illiterate, though, she was very, very smart and tactical in what she was doing. I think that was why she was able to be successful in pursuing and winning this suit and obtaining her son, Peter. In regards to Sarah Wakeman, I am not too sure of her education level. She could read and write. I'm sure she went to school to an extent. But through the records that I looked at, it's not well established exactly how far she went beyond probably those early years.
Emily Howland was, pretty much as highly educated as you could be to be, a woman of her class and time and race. She was sent away from Aurora, where her family was, to Philadelphia to go to a Quaker school, and was educated to the point where she could become a teacher. So that's one way to measure how educated she was.
Yeah, and I would say in the case of these young girls in Troy, first, two of the early teachers in the colored school were really highly educated African-American men. Henry Highland Garnett, who people are very familiar with, he taught in the school for a decade. So they were getting, a really militant education and also a very structured one. The other one was Reverend Daniel Payne, who had come from South Carolina, and he too is extremely highly educated. And then after that, almost all of the teachers were people who were pastors or reverends. So they had high levels of education. And because in the community in Troy, many of the women also formed organizations and societies, they too were pretty highly educated. And so they found like debate clubs for the young girls and reading clubs. So they kind of continued their education, even if they didn't get to high school, in these other intellectual settings, which was pretty advanced for the time, considering that, there were very few African-American women who were being educated in the upper level in America at that time.
We also have some sort of follow-up questions about Emily in relation to whether or not she ever married and what was her no, okay, that's an easy answer.
But that's a really good question. In 10 minutes, I couldn't do it all, but
yeah.
That's a very relevant question here when you're talking about a woman and possessing wealth, but she never married.
Yeah. And was she as heavily involved in suffrage as she was in abolitionist causes, or what was her involvement in the suffrage movement?
She was involved in the suffrage movement, and as I think I mentioned, she helped finance a new building here, or there are other ways that she's helped finance the movement. She was very much networked and connected to a lot of the prominent suffragists in upstate New York. She was not. It's hard to measure degree of involvement, but I will say that when the suffrage movement splits, she kind of doesn't take a very strong side. So she's not one of, the big figureheads of either wing of the suffrage movement. But it's very much an important cause to her. And she doesn't see it as disconnected from abolition, just like many of the others.
We have a question that's funny, Jennifer, while you were speaking and you were talking about the Bosemans, I kept thinking, why does Boseman sound so familiar? But one of our attendees brought it up in their question. Any relation to Chadwick Boseman? If so, that might be of interest.
Not that I have found. However, the two Boseman girls are the sister of Benjamin Boseman, who's actually a surgeon, a Black surgeon during the Civil War. So his early education also was through this Black school in Troy, and then he goes on to be trained as a doctor. And then during the war, where they're trying to pursue education, becoming teachers in the city, he goes and becomes a surgeon in the Civil War. But after that, I have not found a connection to Chadwick or to the town of Boseman either, which I think about I think it's in Montana. I keep looking because it's kind of an interesting last name.
Yeah, a lot of familiar Bosemans out there. I also noticed, Amy, that there's one of the photos, one of the slides you had a photo with from the Library of Congress, from some records of Emily Howland at the Library of Congress. And I'm curious if you know how those records ended up there.
So that's a great story. So there's an Emily Howland photograph album that's at the Library of Congress. And it was actually just purchased by, I think it was a joint purchase of the Library of Congress and the National Museum of African American History and Culture. They together purchased it. So that was only in the last, 5 or 10 years. And they purchased it in part because her book has of Harriet Tubman that had not been seen before. It's the youngest picture of Harriet Tubman. So you may have heard some news in the last, maybe it was 5 years ago or something, about this, oh my gosh, this photo of young Harriet Tubman's been found. And it was in Emily Howland's photograph book. Same book that the picture of Sidney Tolliver that I showed was in. So yeah, they purchased it. It was from a private collector who had it and sold it.
That's so cool that these things end up, and you never know what might be in some archive somewhere just waiting to be discovered.
Yeah,
the reasons
or
why.
somebody's attic or basement or
Yeah.
wherever they're collecting things.
Yeah. Is the community that Emily started in Virginia still in existence?
Yeah, it is. The schoolhouse, so it became part of the public school system, but then later they stopped teaching, they stopped running the school there in 1958. And then eventually the building, it's really in the hands of a church across the street that had always been a sort of affiliate. It was the same community. And so that church, I believe they own the building now. And they were involved in getting national register protection for the schoolhouse. So that community is there. It's obviously very small. It's in Heathsville, Virginia, if anybody is ever in the area.
Well, that's great. I think we are sort of running out of time for questions, but I want to thank you, Amy, Jennifer, Jasmine, so much for sharing these stories with us today. And I want to thank everyone who joined us to listen to these stories today. It's our privilege to make these events available to you and to keep New York State's history alive. And as always, if you're interested in the content we create and want more, please contact us at aptrust@nysed.gov to receive a free past issue of New York Archives magazine. And please join us on April 5th at 12:30 for our next New York Archives magazine online speaker series entitled New York State as a Leader in Environmental Protection. Learn how the history of environmental affairs is reflected in records preserved at the State Archives and how for over 125 years, New York has taken steps to steward our natural environment. Visit our website, www.nysarchivestrust.org to learn more. Thank you again, Amy, Jennifer, Jasmine, for kicking off Women's History Month with us, and thank you for your time today.
For having us.
Thank you.